Welcome everyone who's jumped onto our first webinar in collaboration with AWS, which is extremely exciting. Of course, today we'll be covering off your applications and AWS workspaces. Before I get into a quick agenda, I just wanted to introduce myself quickly. So my name is Toby DeHeer. I'm a business development manager over at Camwood. Been here for nearly a year now. And I guess more importantly, in this particular scenario, I'm sort of responsible for our developing relationship with AWS. So yeah. Danny, if you'd like to change the slide quickly. I just wanted to throw up this quote by Andy Jassy, who of course is AWS's CEO. Essentially what he's trying to get across here is that he genuinely believes that we won't be going back to a 100% office-based model, and that in fact most organizations in the future will be adopting a hybrid model, specifically with the flexibility depending on people's job functions as well. Of course, not the most particularly complex quote, but it has helped shape the EUC offering from AWS, and in fact shape the offerings that we at Camwood have been developing as well. So definitely something to bear in mind as we get into the content. So yeah, quick little agenda here. Of course, at the beginning, we're going to be covering off what AWS Workspaces is. We're going to head into some of the key challenges and considerations that need to be made when looking towards the solution. Then we're going to head into some practical steps to get you started with the transition. From our experience, this is absolutely key. Getting off on a strong foot both makes the transition smoother and a lot quicker as well. And then heading into a bit of Camwood bread and butter, we're going to be looking at your application estate and then managing that throughout the process as well. And then we're going to head over to our colleague Malcolm over at AWS, who's going to look into a customer success story and how they help drive value as well. And then should there be time at the end, a Q&A, a couple of you have already sent through some questions via email. Thank you very much. Of course, if we have the time, we'll get onto this as well. And I'm going to hand over to Daniel, who's going to introduce himself and then pass over to Malcolm, and then we'll head into the core content of the webinar. So yeah, thank you and enjoy.
Good morning, guys. Dan Williams here from Camwood, Head of Technology. Been in the business for about 12 months now. I'm going to be running you through sort of the majority of the content and firing some questions over to Malcolm as we go through it. But as Toby said, if anyone's got any additional questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the chat window. And hopefully you guys enjoy. Malcolm, do you want to introduce yourself?
Certainly, yes. I'm Malcolm Clark. I work within our end user compute specialist sales organization at AWS. I'd like to thank the team at Camwood for inviting us to come and speak with them today. I'm really excited in terms of how the relationship is developing and the opportunities that we have open to us. And I'm hoping today we'll get a lot of that across to you. So some great things will come post-session. Thank you.
Excellent. So we'll sort of kick straight into it from this point of view. So the first logical place to start is really what is AWS Workspaces from this perspective. So from an AWS perspective, Workspaces is ultimately true VDI in public cloud. And when I talk about true VDI, I'm talking ultimately about full desktop experience from this point of view. So we're talking about Windows 10 ultimately. So an end user can log into their device, log into the AWS Workspaces client, and they will be presented with a full desktop as they would probably expect from that point of view. But whilst we're talking about public cloud and we're talking about VDI against sort of comparable solutions, traditional and sort of prem solutions, you've got a completely different model from a TCO perspective. So when we're talking about TCO, if we're talking about on-premises solutions, we're ultimately talking about physical data centers, hardware, power, cooling, everything that's associated to that, and the ability for AWS to provide an alternative solution that is entirely hosted on public cloud. So you're not looking after the physical infrastructure anymore. You don't have to worry about swapping out hard drives or anything like that. You're just interested ultimately at the layer that the customer, that your employees or your customers are going to be logging into from that perspective. So from an ongoing variable cost model, it's a much lower TCO than traditional on-premises infrastructure. And when we're talking about sort of the management layer and the operational support associated to it, there's sort of two ways you can look at it. If you're in AWS at the moment, it's just an extension of the existing management plane. So your existing operations team will be able to pick up the AWS Workspaces solution and work with it quite easily. At the same time, if you haven't got any form of AWS public cloud, it is very, very quick and easy to get moving on Workspaces. So what I'm trying to get across here is ultimately the seamlessness and the simplicity of what AWS has done with Workspaces ultimately means any organization, regardless whether or not they're actually utilizing AWS public cloud, is that they can pick up and run with it very, very easily. And because we're talking about public cloud, we're ultimately talking about the native technology that comes in with AWS. So you get the full unlimited scaling that's available within the platform, rapid deployment models, integration with all the native AWS tool sets, etc. from that point of view. So security posture, monitoring, auditing, everything that comes wrapped into the solution as a whole. But Malcolm, I'm just going to throw a question over to you, if that's okay. So it's interesting how COVID-19 and the working from home mandate pushed across all governments, ultimately across the globe, has changed how organizations are adapting working from home. So I'd be interested to get your take on how organizations and your customers have seen workspaces almost fill a void or solve a problem for organizations as they start to try and move into this working from home model.
I think the interesting thing is, over the course of the last 12 months or so, every organization has had different challenges and use cases that they've had to adapt towards, whether they be the remote worker, whether they be those developers that are needing access to high-end kit and machines, or even contact centers. And so I think it's important initially to understand that when we've approached things over the course of the last year, we've really tried to understand the needs of the customers. Now, during that time frame, those needs have evolved. Initially, organizations were looking at how they could deliver a laptop out with VPN for their users to actually be able to access corporate applications and so on and so forth. But that threw a challenge initially, because they were going, hang on a minute, I can't get access to a lot of this kit. The supply isn't there. There's all sorts of challenges in the world. What can I do to overcome this? Okay, I could look at a traditional model. You know, we have a little bit of capacity left in our traditional on-premise VDI. However, it's going to run out really quickly. So organizations that traditionally maybe only had 10, 20, 30% of their team operating on that model, we're now going, well, we're going to need 100%. Everyone has to work from home. Everyone has to work remotely. So they needed a model that could quickly adapt to that requirement, that was enabling them to be both agile and flexible, but at the same time thinking about speed. So what we've done over the course of the last year is made sure we've understood the pain of those customers under the workspaces model that we have, that we're talking about today, and we made sure that we've adapted to that change. It's really important to also think about is the three pillars that we think about. So security, fundamentally the most important thing we think about on a daily basis. Organizations are concerned with any of their data and what's going to happen to that. So we had to ensure that that was absolutely the heart of any discussions we had. Secondly, was around reliability. If we're going to deliver the service, it had to work. Thirdly, agility. You've talked about flexibility and scale. We needed to ensure that we could scale up quickly, but there could have been also times when they would need to scale down. So they had to have that flexibility built in. But thirdly, and most importantly, traditional VDI is expensive. You're always thinking about hardware, software, and services. So what we needed to do is ensure that the managed service that we offer under Workspaces was both cost effective and able to optimize at the same time. So if you had a requirement that was flexing, then we could flex with it. Does that help?
That's exactly what we've been seeing in the marketplace. We talk to customers from that point of view, and it's fantastic. We're aligned from this perspective as well. Excellent, thank you. So again, Malcolm, I'm going to pick on you a little bit as we go through these as well, so I do apologize in advance. But from comparing Workspaces to alternative traditional on-premises solutions, and in some cases they have solutions built on top of public cloud. But from our point of view, when we talk about traditional on-premises solutions, we talk about the complexity, the different levels of licensing, which is kind of wrapped into complexity as well, the different levels of skill retention, the management overhead associated to it. I suppose starting from the logical step at the top, when I think about complexity, I think about on-premises, I think about physical data centers, I think about everything that comes along with that. From your point of view, when you talk to customers about on-premises traditional infrastructure and compare it to Workspaces, what kind of differences are you seeing really from a Workspaces point of view versus traditional on-prem?
Well, although this is a great slide and it shows how Workspaces potentially compares to some extent to other solutions in the market. We don't typically talk about how do we compare with other solutions in the market. And the reason for that is we don't really feel that our solution is completely in line with what they're doing. So it's not apples with apples. We offer a managed service which effectively means that it's not a managed service in the sense of you get everything provided, but in terms of from an infrastructure and delivery point of view, everything is included. All those traditional building blocks that you would expect for an on-premise. So whether that be that, again, I talked earlier about the hardware requirements, the software requirements and management of all of those, the administration, the resourcing to support that, all of that is included in our managed approach. The only piece that our customers really need to be thinking about is those users that they have. So if they have all sorts of different users around the world, remember, we're not alienating this into one particular market. This is a global piece that we can deliver anywhere. We make sure that the customers own their people, number one. And secondly, we want to ensure that the customers have control of what is being delivered from an image perspective and from an application point of view. If we think about the traditional, if we're going to deliver those on a traditional on-premise VDI, you have to be thinking about all of those different building blocks. So whether that be, where am I going to get the next new server from? Is the supply there? Can I scale up because I can't get, extra capacity? So you don't need to think about that so much when you're talking about workspaces, because that is obviously a part of the solution that we're providing.
Yeah.
The other thing that I mentioned a moment ago was around just making sure that, when it's needed, it's available. And I'll talk a little bit later about some examples of customer successes we've had where we've actually scaled up incredibly quickly. During the course of the COVID pandemic period, we had very large customers of ours that were looking for turnaround in the thousands of users in a few weeks. So we have good customer references available already today, whereby we were able to, working with partners like Camwood, put together a solution and deliver a proof of concept out to deployment within only a few weeks. You cannot do that with a traditional on-premise model. It can only be done with a managed service where the infrastructure is readily available to the customers, and that's why we differentiate.
Yeah, no, that's all really good points, and I suppose your last point really plugs into one of my key things when we talk about workspaces, the inaccessibility for SME markets from this point of view. So regardless of you're a 5-seat organization or a 5,000-seat organization, it makes no difference from a workspaces perspective. Yeah. And I think that's really important when we talk to customers, especially where they may have a BYOD policy at the moment, but they haven't got the security on the physical devices in a BYOD scenario. So being able to provision something like workspaces very quickly, I think is really beneficial from that point of view. I'm just going to throw this up here in terms of the architecture. So some may or may not have seen this particular architecture model from top to bottom, and I'm not going to talk about it in length. It's potentially quite a complex diagram. I'm sure we could be here for hours talking about it. But I'm just going to pull out a couple of key points to talk about when we're talking about existing infrastructure and ultimately how workspaces can plug in and integrate into your existing infrastructure. I think the obvious place to start is authentication. So regardless whether or not if you've got existing Active Directory on premises or if you've got a siloed authentication method at the moment, what workspaces can do is, with the power of utilizing something like the VPN technology or Direct Connect, you can actually integrate both platforms together quite seamlessly, so your Active Directory users are able to log in with the same user credentials as they would expect from a traditional on-premises infrastructure, and everything that sort of comes along with it. So if you're talking about MFA, access to existing data infrastructure, application infrastructure, it's all there from that perspective. Now, if you flip that on its head ever so slightly, for an example, if a customer is fully an AWS public cloud and they've got EC2, they've got serverless models, any form of sort of different AWS function or workload, Workspaces is actually able to pull and integrate with that as well from that perspective. So it's a very flexible model. It integrates with existing on-premises and public cloud workloads, so you can provide ultimately an end-to-end solution from an employee or a customer basis from that point of view. And it's also worth pointing out is you can actually isolate workspaces quite nicely as well at the same time. So if you've got a third party that needs to access your infrastructure, or if you've got contractors working within the environment, you can actually isolate their workspaces infrastructure and keep them segregated and isolated away from the rest of the infrastructure. So there's another layer of security integration from that point of view. So from a considerations point of view, there's a lot of things you need to be aware of, and Malcolm, I'll ask your opinion on it once I've gone through these. But the way we talk to customers about VDI and we talk to them about workspaces, there's a number of different things an organization needs to go through in terms of an initial data capture before you start making the transition. So the first most important thing is ultimately to start with user persona information. And when I talk about user persona information, I'm talking ultimately about a theoretical profile of your users. So this profile may be something along the lines of, you've got an information worker, they need low resources, so 2 CPU RAM, 2 CPU and 4 gig of RAM, and they just need Office and a couple of SaaS apps. That might be an information worker. Now, at the same time, you may have a bunch of users that are graphical intensive. So they may have, they might be using something like Rivet or AutoCAD, something that's really graphical intensive from that point of view. So they're going to need a different set of resources versus the information workers. So it's really important that you start building out that user persona information and the user profile information to start building out the target workloads and ultimately what it needs to look like from an end-to-end state perspective. And whilst you're doing the user persona information, you also need to take into consideration ultimately how your users are interacting with your applications at the moment. So how are they currently delivered? Are you using something like Zen App or Zen Desktop? Yeah, for full fat VDI versus app streaming. What kind of issues they're facing today? And I think one of the classic ones we've seen a lot is geographical location of infrastructure and how the apps are delivered to the end user, and really sort of blanket use case. Well, we've got a customer that had all of their infrastructure in the UK, but they had a bunch of users based in Asia. Now, the way these applications were being delivered to the users in Asia was through an app streaming technology. Now, these particular apps had a really low latency requirement, and the end users were getting a very bad performance experience with that. Now, if you took that, lifted and shifted it, and dropped it into something like Workspaces, you were going to see exactly the same problems there for that. So you need to understand what users, what the problems are for the users at the moment, how the applications are being delivered, and ultimately how you can deal with that as you move into public cloud. Do you need to change the model, how things are being delivered? Do you potentially need to drop additional infrastructure closer to their geographical location? All of these things, including performance requirements, are ultimately going to give you an end-to-end view of what the target state needs to look like. And then finally, the application roadmap, and I think it's something that a lot of organizations don't talk enough about, is ultimately you've got your application estate at the moment. Depending on whether or not you've got an existing VDI, it can potentially be very, very complex and potentially not to best practice. The amount of organizations that still work in full-blown application estates, but they've got a lot of scripts running in the background, it doesn't work well in terms of sort of moving forwards in terms of the roadmap. So when you look at applications, you need to think about, okay, we can take our apps as they are and we can drop them into something like AWS Workspaces, but we're potentially going to see the same sort of problems they're seeing now. So it's a good opportunity to take to go ahead and start mapping out the application transition roadmap to say, okay, we should probably repackage these applications, or we should probably look at delivering these applications in a different manner from that point of view. But Malcolm, everything that I've talked about here from a considerations point of view, do you think there's anything else a customer needs to be aware of when moving to something like AWS Workspaces?
I think it's not necessarily a case of being aware of. One of the things that I'm keen to get across is, in terms of the relationship we're developing with Camwood, it's the importance of really understanding what the requirements are within the customer and spending the time to really deep dive the different use cases. Within AWS, we have an approach that we call working backwards. And that whole working backwards approach is about understanding the pain of the customer and what their outcome needs to be based on that pain, and then working backwards from that. So if I think about, what is Workspaces as an example, Workspaces is a persistent virtual desktop environment that's delivered as a managed service, pay as you go. By persistent, I mean, we offer one-to-one environments to each of those users that remains with them irrespective of whether they're logged in or not. But at the same time, we offer it under a Windows umbrella, or in fact a Linux umbrella. So if you have users that have a requirement that are fairly generic, they go, well, we're using fairly standard Windows applications, then great, we've got a service that can support that. But at the flip side of that, if you have developer environments that have very, very specific tools that they need to deliver on, within a Linux space, then absolutely that's something we can support them with. So I think it's more a case of, how do we spend the time to understand, what is it they need today? How do we future-proof that in terms of where they're going tomorrow? And just making sure that we're spending the time and energy to get close to their needs. One of the things that we found over the course of the last year is there are some scenarios where customers have said, look, we just need a remote, we need a remote working solution. And then what we found is over the first few months is it wasn't quite optimized to their needs. And a lot of that was because the world needed it yesterday. But what we've learned over the course of the last year, especially when we're working with partners, is we can spend the time to get closer to those needs. Because the product is, flexible, agile, and the time to market is so quick, then it allows us that, that space, if you like, where traditionally we would spend months and months and months on a proof of concept. We don't need to do that anymore because we can get down to the basics very quickly. We can understand what are the different use cases very, very early on in the discussion, and we can make sure we're then tailoring the solution to their needs. And then whether that be, a remote worker that is a contractor, it could be a third party or an employee, right the way up to a lab environment where they're using high-end graphics intensive solutions, then we make sure that we deliver the right solution for them. And the other thing, although we're not going into the detail on it necessarily today, but certainly, we have other solutions that sit within our space. So we have an application streaming solution too, called AppStream 2.0, that we can also explore with your customers. And we're starting to do that. And that comes down to making sure that we're delivering the right solution to the right problem.
Excellent. Definitely great feedback from there, Malcolm. Thank you very much. So as we start to move through the transition phases, typically we see it as two types of transitions, really. You've got a Brownfield transition and a Greenfield transition. The Brownfield one's quite an interesting one because typically it's going to be existing VDI. So they will have something at the moment, regardless of the solution, they will have some form of VDI from this perspective. It's potentially going to be quite complex. There's a lot of users, a lot of applications. There could be a longer project life cycle going from end to end, and that's simply because they're a little bit more rigid in terms of their approach. But the building blocks and ultimately the work streams that we've identified here on the right hand side are ultimately the same as any way you sort of look at it from this perspective. You may swap out a few different points, or you may sort of add in a couple of different points, but ultimately it's going to be the same thing. So when we talk about evaluation of readiness, we're talking about everything that I was talking about within the consideration slide. So have you captured your user persona data? Have you got all your performance requirements down, et cetera, et cetera? It's all of that data capture that you need to ensure that you've got before you start building out that target state environment. And there's a number of different tools out there, like Lakeside Nextthink, and obviously AWS, that can help you map out that user persona, the existing workload information, all your data infrastructure. And as you start to move into the build and deploy phase, this is ultimately where you start getting into the meat of the project itself. So building out the AWS infrastructure to support your workspaces solutions. And to ensure that organizations build in the correct manner, we would always suggest that building following AWS best practices. So in this particular use case, it could be something like AWS Landing Zone or the Cloud Adoption Framework, something to give an organization a good stepping stone to start building out their infrastructure on. I've seen organizations build quickly, not particularly in the best practice, and they've had to roll back because they've done a big bang approach, and it's hurt them a little bit from that perspective. So it's ensuring when you go into the build and deploy, you've got the right metrics in place, you've got the right security posture, policies, etc., everything that you need to succeed in the public cloud platform. And then when you move into the migrate phase, there's ultimately a two-pronged approach. You can do the big bang, and like I said, it could potentially give you a lot of issues associated to it. Or alternatively, you could wrap into a smaller batch cycle in terms of releases. So when I talk about smaller batch cycles, I like to look at it in a very similar manner to how low-code, no-code application development works. So ultimately, you build, you migrate, you support, you test all the way through it, and it just keeps going in that continuous cycle. But the idea is you do it in small batches of users, so when you get those users into the platform, you can support them a lot easier than you can the entire organization at once from that perspective. Greenfield, on the flip side, it's a lot easier. Typically, when we see it, they haven't got an existing VDI. They will have some form of remote access solutions, so they may have VPN solutions in there. They may have a BYOD policy like we were talking about before, and they're just utilizing SaaS applications, but there's no centralized control. But ultimately, the transition phases kind of stay the same. So again, you need to figure out what that target state looks like. Have you got the right workloads? Have you mapped out your data and application infrastructure correctly? And then you go through the same cycle of build and deploy. But the migrate phase could probably move a little bit quicker, that we've seen in this particular perspective, because an organization has got nothing beforehand. They were just working on their local devices. So if you give them a new environment, you could probably typically move a little bit quicker from that point of view. Now, as we get into the transition, this is really sort of focusing on the end-to-end journey that we see organizations go through. You can look at it for infrastructure, you can look at it in applications. I think the back end of this shows the more focus on applications, but you kick off with the user persona information that we've talked about at the beginning. I cannot stress how important this is if you're making a transition into something like workspaces. But ultimately, you start to map out how the delivery requirements are going to match up in AWS Workspaces. You need to understand how the applications are going to be supported moving forwards from an application lifecycle perspective. How are you going to deal with application updates end to end? How are you going to deal with new applications coming into the state? All of those things need to be mapped out end to end from this perspective. And then as you move through the transformation and the leveraging existing deployment techniques, Workspaces can actually support something like SCCM right now, or alternatively, you could use something like Application Manager to deliver your apps. And alternatively, you can bake everything into the operating system itself. But ultimately, at the back end of it, you will come out with an understanding, an idea of, do your end users need a full fat VDI solution like Workspaces, or potentially, as Malcolm mentioned, utilizing something like AppStream 2.0 that can stream applications to users. And at the same time, we've seen a mixture and a combination of both things at the same time as well. So they may have graphical intensive workloads that need to work off AppStream technology, but you can deliver those into Workspaces. So I think it's just showing the flexibility of the platform, regardless of your needs. AWS Workspaces will be able to work with you from that point of view. But Malcolm, just before we jump into the piece around the success that you've had with one of the customers, it would be really, really good if you could highlight from your point of view anything else in the transition phase that organizations need to be aware of, or certainly need to consider, or any additional steps in the transition that you've seen above and beyond what I'm showing here.
Yeah, I think this is fantastic. It is showing the journey that we go on, and certainly the journey that we go on when working with partners. I think going back to something I said previously, is it's really important to spend the time understanding what is it we're trying to achieve, and then making sure that the outcome is in line with the expectations. So it's all very well us kind of saying we want to deliver a desktop, a virtual desktop, a Windows desktop to an employee, but is that actually what that particular employee needs to be successful? And I think so it's important to just make sure that when we're going through this process as early as possible, we're deep diving what those needs are. And I say that because you've mentioned AppStream 2.0. We've designed the two solutions from Workspaces to AppStream intentionally different because they aren't the same. There are scenarios where customers require a full virtual desktop, Windows or Linux in our case, but there's also scenarios where they don't. We do differentiate between the two because one is persistent and one is non-persistent. We can talk about that in detail offline, and I'm sure we'll deep dive this with the customers when we do the follow-up. But the important piece is just making sure that, when we're thinking about all of those different pillars that I mentioned earlier, especially when thinking about security, is making sure that we cover those off as early as possible. Because there's nothing worse than getting to the end of a proof of concept and going, oh, it didn't do this or it didn't do that. It might well be able to do that, but we didn't document that. We didn't deep dive that early on in the process. So it's just a case of, in terms of the work that we're going to be doing with Camwood going forward, is making sure that we do exactly that. When we spend time with the customer, we understand their needs, we try and future-proof those needs, and we make sure that we're not just thinking about that single use case, because the world is evolving. If you went back 14 months ago, we were a completely different place. You would have had pockets of organizations using this kind of technology. Today, especially as we're evolving towards this new hybrid workforce, of which Andy Jassy, the quote you mentioned earlier, organizations have got different levels of expectation. And I think we are adapting with that, but we need to ensure that the tools that we're providing to support it are absolutely right for the audience. So that's the only thing I would say. In terms of that end-to-end piece, almost start at the end and then work back to the beginning.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right from that point of view. You need to ensure that you've got the right metrics at the beginning or at the end to ensure that you're hitting the right marks all the way through. Thank you very much. So
I think finally, as we get to the end of the main sort of core content of the webinar, I guess there's one more question, and that's what's next. A lot of webinars we've hosted in the past, it's usually just leave up some contact details. There's a bit of a Q&A, which hopefully we'll still have time for, and we go from there. But in this particular instance, there is an additional thing for us to discuss. And for those of you watching, afterwards, if you're not familiar, AWS are actually offering a free sort of 54 user POC that's, I believe, valid until the end of July. And yeah, that's usually quite different to what we offer. So yeah, it's a 54 user POC that allows organizations essentially to stand up some users within the Workspaces environment, gain value from it with, of course, no investment. I think that equates to around about 10,000 hours of usage, which is pretty good value for money.
10,000 hours a month, just to be clear.
10,000 hours a month. Okay,
yeah.
Cool. Thank you for clarifying, Malcolm. And then, of course, if you haven't seen the invite already, hopefully you have, but you're also eligible to a free one-to-one consultation or complimentary consultation with both myself and Danny. Of course, we can go through all of the topics that we've covered today, whether that be user personas and any other sort of key considerations moving forward. But essentially, the aim of this is to combine that with the POC so that we can really help you design that POC within that session. I think one of the key areas where Camwood and AWS align is that it is truly sort of customer centric. You know, we want to make this specific to you. A couple of the examples have been specific to particular industries. We really do want to help you utilize this for your own organization and your own considerations as well. Like I said, it looks like we are going to have a few minutes for Q&A, although, like I said, we've had some come in already. But of course, if there are any outstanding questions that we don't get to, please feel free to email them to the email there, or Danny, or reach out to Malcolm as well. It's absolutely fine. So yeah, guys, we've got around about 5 minutes or so for a Q&A. I've had a couple come through, as I said beforehand. So yeah, I'm just going to throw it over to you guys. So one of the questions here is, what do you see as the biggest challenge an organization might face when moving towards an AWS Workspaces environment?
That's a good question. I think it really, Malcolm, I grab your opinion on it as well. But it entirely depends on kind of what situation they find themselves in a minute. And ultimately, I think what Malcolm pulled out at the beginning is what the requirements are. So, you know, if their requirements are provisioning something really, really quickly that's going to be functional for informational workers across the organization really quickly, I think that's going to be quite straightforward. When you start wrapping layers of complexity into it, and you've got probably a little bit more planning to do for that target state, you need to start with the information at the beginning. So everything we were talking about, user personas and security posture, the integrations that need to be wrapped into it, those are challenges, but they're not difficult to work through as long as you've got the right steer. But Malcolm, I don't know if you've got an opinion on the biggest challenge moving across the workspaces.
I think, yeah, I would probably say, you know, in terms of anything that you're going to deliver, is Amazon Workspaces is different to what you probably already have. So you really do have to think about how your mindset will have to adapt to that. We're not comparing something that traditionally you did within your own data center, perhaps, or in fact, something that may be available from other parties. This is a pay-as-you-go model, whereby we offer that complete service. So, you know, you are having to think about that change. We do work with many organizations of many sizes, and each of those organizations have different needs, and they have different levels of expertise too. And I think you need to think about that expertise that is needed and make sure that it is in line with your expectations. I was on a call yesterday with a customer in South Africa, and we spent a good 40 minutes early on in the call just trying to determine what is the right solution for you. So spend the time to understand what that is. I think you've said about managing expectations. And then also don't lose sight of the fact that, you know, we are providing something that, you know, is not your traditional sort of hardware software service piece, you know, from a commercial perspective. We're offering a solution that you can take delivery of both from an hourly model, should you choose it, so which is a true consumption pay-as-you-go piece. Or in fact, you know, if you want it at a monthly point of view, you know, we offer that flexibility. So spend the time to understand the needs, spend the time understanding, you know, the requirements, not just locally, but internationally. because of course we have data centers around the world and we need to make sure that we're aligning them in the right way. And then spend the time making sure that from a user perspective, their expectations are met. So it's not necessarily just about IT, it's about those users. You know, what are they going to do? How are they going to use it?
Fantastic, thank you. I think we've got 3 minutes left. I noticed that most of the participants are still here. So this one's probably one for both of you, but maybe starting with Danny. You mentioned earlier, Malcolm, that there is a managed service provided by AWS. We've had a question come in that is more around a traditional managed service. How can users or organizations help with that end user management? The end user support, the day-to-day management, introducing new applications and stuff like that. What does that look both from a partner perspective and from AWS's point of view?
Yeah, so I think that's really, really important because, the delivery of workspaces is done through your AWS console. So you as a customer have complete control over what are you delivering to whom and what parameters are you setting within that. So you have that control and that flexibility. I think in terms of how we work with partners, and this is really, really important, is it's the partners that we work with, Camwood, that are providing that value. You enable us to really get to know the customers in detail. You enable us to deliver these solutions quickly and efficiently, because that's really important. Especially during the pandemic period, we had customers, when you ask the question of when do you need this, they we need it now. So I think it's really important to have the partners like Camwood to enable us to scale up quickly. But also, as I say, don't lose sight of the fact that this is a service that you have control over. You haven't got to be thinking about capacity and buying more hardware that you need to get from a hardware vendor or software because your licensing might run out. It's all there. You don't need to think about load balancing and things like this. We do that for you. What you need to think about is who are the users, what are their needs, making sure that everything they're doing is secure, in terms of, from a profile and delivery point of view, and then making sure that the applications and service that's being delivered to them is as optimized as it can be, because that's really important. We spend a lot of time and energy in making sure that what is optimized is in line with expectations. That then provides an even better service. And if that means that we're billing less, that's absolutely fine at AWS. It's about providing value to the customers.
Perfect. Thank you, Malcolm. Anything to add on that, Danny, just before we clock off?
Yeah, I appreciate we've probably got about 60 seconds left, but from a partner perspective, everything to do with public cloud is to do with standardization. The way we're able to support and help customers through this through a co-managed service rather than keys to the kingdom from that point of view. We standardize and we try to automate as much as physically possible. So ensuring that we've got a strong relationship with the customer, that we have the best interest of the customer at heart is ultimately what we do from a day-to-day basis. If we were to just throw bodies at it and just work through tickets, we're not driving value, we're just providing a break fix. Everything that Camwood does is proactive and remediation sort of at the heart of it. So if there's optimization opportunities, if there's additional feature sets that need to be wrapped into the solution, that's our job as a technology partner to help you through that, rather than just working through tickets and saying we'll hit all SLAs, etc. So we take it a step further, but with it, I could talk for hours about this, but appreciate we're out of time.
Fantastic. Right, I think that's bang on 9:30. Hopefully everybody found that beneficial and it was worth your time, especially at 8:45 in the morning. But yeah, if there are any other outstanding questions, like I said, please feel free to email me on the email address you can see on slide. Malcolm, we'd like to thank both you and AWS and the wider team for jumping on today. We really, really appreciate your input. And yeah, I think we'll leave it there. There will be a recording going out at some point, hopefully in the next few days. But yeah, thank you everyone for joining, and we'll see you next time.